After centuries of persecution, it is understandable that LGBTQ2S communities emphasize the heroes and pioneers of their shared history. But as fans of the podcast Bad Gays already know, there is also much to learn from the villains, outsiders, and even evil queers. It's complicated, and now it's also a book titled Bad Gays, A Homosexual History, and we're joined by the creators of both. In Berlin, Germany on the right, Ben Miller, and in Barcelona, Spain on the left, Hugh Lemmey. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So Ben and Hugh, you started a podcast some years ago entitled Bad Gays. Now some of those characters have made their way to the pages of your new book, but before we get to those characters, let me ask you, Ben, what led you to focus on the darker sides of homosexuality? Because it's quite a leap from the language and sort of imagery surrounding the LGBTQ2S movement.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having us. The impetus for the show was that we were constantly frustrated by the yawning gap between the conversations that we were having with our friends about these topics, about queer history, and where the public conversation was. And we found that the conversations that we were having among ourselves were really interesting, were really justice-oriented, were really focused on telling complicated stories and questioning mainstream assumptions, even the kind of mainstream assumptions of the movement. And we didn't see those conversations happening in public-facing media. And so we decided to start the show as a way of hanging some of these big theoretical questions on some fun, sexy, interesting stories that give you all the drama that you want, but also start to bring in some of those themes that we felt really weren't being addressed.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about the drama, and Hugh, I'm coming to you. From its inception, did you get a lot of pushback from this project, even from the podcast and then towards the book as well?
No, absolutely no pushback at all from the podcasts, because I think, as Ben was saying, there's a real appetite out there for these conversations. I think we're all sort of used to Pride Month rolling around, and there's a sort of 10 great queer heroes who you need to know about. And it's the sort of the same stories again and again, which are really important for creating our history, for talking about our identity.
All right, Hugh, let's talk about some of those stories. Let's start with a name that many are familiar with. That's Oscar Wilde. However, the focus in your book is not on Wilde, but on his young lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Boise. Hugh, what made him the right person for your rogue gallery of gays?
Well, we all know, if you're aware of the story of Oscar Wilde, who is obviously portrayed very much as a hero of the LGBTQ movement, and especially the sort of one of the early figures who was stood up and said, yes, this is me and I'm not ashamed of it. You might know the story of Bosie, who was his young lover. But that story tends to be told and ends with the trial and then the sad death of Oscar Wilde, the premature death of Oscar Wilde after he's sort of destroyed by his prison sentence. But if you actually look at Bosie's life, the story is, first of all, much more complicated in leading up to that trial. I mean, the Oscar Wilde as a heroic figure should be really complicated anyway, because some of the relationships he was involved in were quite predatory, quite difficult anyway. So that's one aspect of it. But then after Wilde dies, Bosie's life really spins off in a very strange direction, and he renounces his homosexuality. He has a short-lived, disastrous marriage to a young poet who he's very cruel to. And then over the course of the First World War, he becomes involved in, I guess, the proto-fascist movement in England. He writes for the Vigilante, which is a proto-fascist magazine. He adopts a very sort of orthodox Catholicism, and he becomes deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And so that was one of the stories we're like, well, there's just as much going on there that tells a story about how our identity came to be and our relationship with power, and why did Bosie do these things, as that sort of a traditional heroic story about Oscar Wilde standing up for himself. And in standing up for himself and putting himself in public in that way, he really put Bosie in a very difficult position as well, although Bosie forced him to make a lot of those decisions. And the end result being that Bosie really rejected it. So there's a lot of really interesting things to learn from that history about the pressures that were on gay men at that time, and the fact that so many of them in that early movement were not these brave heroes, were very complicated, prejudiced, difficult people for us to talk about.
Ben, you write that homosexuality was invented in the 19th century. Obviously, you didn't mean same-sex attraction. That's been with us for quite some time. Can you break it down? What's the difference here?
Sure. So this is one of the biggest differences between how people who think about and study the history of sexuality a lot think about these identities and how they're spoken about by the kind of mainstream element of the movement. So when we say that homosexuality dates to about 1870, we don't mean that there is no historical evidence of same-sex desire or gender nonconformity before then. Far from it. Those things have been with us forever, and those things always will be. But the idea that your sexual object choice, right, the person that you are sexually and romantically attracted to, that is a really foundational part of your identity as a human being, and that the difference between a same or a different sex object choice is a really foundational difference in the kind of person you are. And then all of the kind of social institutions that build up around that difference, that is what we're talking about as being new. And so in that sense, heterosexuality is also new. Heterosexuality in the sense of different sex object choice is incredibly important to my self-identity. And we're sort of creating a whole bunch of institutions around this idea of dating leading to marriage and this sort of path of romantic love. In many ways, that's actually a reaction to homosexuality and all of these other things that are being identified by doctors and medical scientists and then turned into these scandals, and then seemingly quote unquote normal people have to define something for themselves against that. And I think it can be really easy to confuse that argument that I'm making here with this really old homophobic lie, right? The lie that we're used to from all kinds of conservative histories where, oh, maybe they were just good friends. And, okay, it's two people, they're like on the Greek vase and we can all see what they're doing, right? But if we think a little more deeply about that Greek vase, right, what the same-sex desire, the form that same-sex desire was taking among those elite Greeks who are depicting it on their vases is that adult men are the insertive partner for younger men, but they're also married, right? And that's not what today's homosexuality looks like. And so we can see from that both the evidence of these forms of desire always existing and also the differences, the real differences in the kind of forms and institutional forms that they take and what they mean to people. And that's kind of what we mean by that. And the stories in the book are really mostly about how we get from point A to point B, right? How we get from same-sex desire as being a thing that exists to same-sex desire becoming such a constitutive part of people's feelings about themselves, and also a major part of the way that they are handled and regulated and dealt with by doctors, by legal authorities, by police. And none of that is particularly self-evident. And so that's what the stories are really about.
So I want to follow up with you, talk about the main protagonist in the first chapter, Roman Emperor Hadrian. How do you handle the problems of describing gayness or homosexuality way before these terms existed? Talk to me about sort of that navigation.
I've always felt, because I'm a historian with academic training and Hugh isn't, I've often felt like the one who has to be that sort of boring person, sort of boring, tendentious person who comes in and raps us on the knuckles and says, well, it was all very different back then. I think the approach that we've come to use in the show, and one that I think is really useful, is that when we apply the label gay, we're not making a definitive claim about someone's identity, right? If you explain to Emperor Hadrian what modern homosexuality was, he'd be just as confused as if you showed him an airplane. What we can do is we can ask ourselves, what does applying this label gay to Hadrian, based on all of these things about him that ended up becoming part of what gay became, tell us about us, less than tell us about him? So yes, it's a story about him and Hadrian, but really when we apply these labels sort of ahistorically, what we're trying to do is look at how these identities came to be and what we learn about ourselves by doing it.
All right, Hugh, with that, I need to ask about Emperor Hadrian. He's viewed as one of the more successful Roman emperors. What made him become a bad character in your book exactly?
I think Hadrian would firmly fall into the category of complicated. It's like evil and complicated. And really, we talk about his relationship with Antinous, his young lover, a young Greek man who he falls in love with, much younger than him, and his very, very complicated relationship, where they sort of travel around the Mediterranean. And the thing to understand about Hadrian is he is a lover of Greece. He's a lover of the Hellenic tradition, and he brings in the idea of Hellenism into Rome, or he rebuilds on this idea of Hellenism, which is this obsession that the Romans had with Greek culture and Greek mythology, Greek history, and art. And he's really an obsessive almost about Greek culture, and he wants to build himself up in the model of the ancient Greeks. And so he takes this young lover, and he sort of takes him back to Greece, where he involves him in all these magical rituals around oracles and these sort of ancient Greek traditions. Finally, then taking him on this sort of tour of the Mediterranean to Egypt, where he involves him in these rites, these magical rites of ancient Egyptian religion, which ends in this very confused way. We don't really know quite what happens, but Antinous either drowns or is drowned in the Nile. Some ancient sources say that it was an accident that he drowns, but some others suggest that actually he was drowned or perhaps committed suicide as a sort of sacrifice for Hadrian. So yeah, there's a super complicated relationship there. And I think the other thing that's very fascinating about Hadrian is a lot of the story of how the gay identity was formed and homosexual identity was formed in the 19th century. In some ways, there's an analogy with the way nationalism is formed. The idea of this thing that has always existed is taken from these stories from the past. So the Victorians in the 19th century in Germany, these men who start to identify as something that we might today think of as homosexual or gay. They look to the past for examples, and they use this history from the past to create our contemporary identity. So in choosing Hadrian, you have on one hand this fascinating story about his own life and his military conquests and his persecution of Jews in Judea, and also his frankly quite crazy sort of love life. And then you also have this story into the 19th century of people looking back towards Hadrian, towards the Greeks, towards the Romans, in order to say, we have always been here. So that's kind of a foundational story as well. And people look to Hadrian right back to Oscar Wilde, for example, and say, not only were we always here, but we've been emperors and kings and artists and writers, and our sexuality, this way that we form our lives around same-sex desire, is not something to be ashamed of, but is a source of greatness. So that's kind of what's so interesting about Hadrian's story, I think.
All right, so we talked about the first character of your book. I want to get to the last character of your book, Pim Fortuyn, who dies in 2002, is assassinated. Ben, how did he end up in your rogue gallery?
Well, I think we were really interested in looking at what happens to this gay male identity after this really remarkable kind of end zone run that it makes in the 20th century, where at the beginning of the 20th century, it's still in many circles a very fringe concept. And by the end of the 20th century, in countries like the Netherlands, where Pim Fortuyn was a politician, the kind of basic civil rights consensus is starting to be accepted really across the political spectrum. The consensus around things like marriage equality and military service, this kind of civil equality. Pim Fortuyn is someone who starts out on the center left of politics. He then ends up writing a very provocative newspaper column, and then becoming one of the first leaders of this kind of new far right in Europe that we've seen since the early 2000s only gain ground, this kind of post-fascist this sort of post-fascist politics of people who are very eager to kind of shed some of the old image connotations of the far right, but are still definitely far-right political figures who are really agitating against immigrants, agitating in favor of white supremacy, and using deindustrialization and using some of these economic challenges as a way to drum up hatred against anyone who looks different, and to propose things like complete bans on immigration to the Netherlands. That was one of Fortuyn's policies. Another one of Fortuyn's policies was, or another one of Fortuyn's statements, political statements, was referring to the entire religion and culture of Islam using a Dutch word that translates in English to retarded. And so this is someone who's really a proud racist, and at the same time builds an enormous amount of political popularity by playing up his homosexuality, giving really outrageous TV interviews where he's talking about the taste of male ejaculate, where he's talking about how being in a dark room is like being in church because you're on your knees and there's low light coming in from a window on the left, where he's talking about how he can't possibly be racist because he likes sleeping with Moroccan men. And all of this is really politically effective because it gives Dutch liberals a pathway towards voting for someone who is very far right, because the kind of assumption is, well, how could you possibly be intolerant if you're voting for me, this very outre, very publicly gay person? He does get assassinated only days before the 2002 elections in the Netherlands, and becomes a kind of Dutch national hero. And that brand of politics is only becoming more current. In Germany, where I live, the far-right political party, one of its parliamentary leaders is Alice Fidel, who's a lesbian. In France, gay men and lesbians now vote actually more for the far right than voters of their social and economic and racial strata. And so you see this kind of pattern happening a lot, and that's why we thought it was important to talk about Fortuyn's life and to fit him in as one of our possible endings of the book. There's a more hopeful ending after that, where we talk about all of the ways that solidarity between queer people and other kinds of people has worked. But Fortuyn is our kind of nightmare ending.
I think it's fair to say that, the argument that bad gays must be seen as part of the LGBTQ history has not been quite accepted yet. And I want to talk about a more sort of recent example. The attack that Netflix has recently got around the classification of a new series. It's called Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. And it was tagged as an LGBTQ sort of material. They got plenty of flack, and it was removed. And Hugh, I want to come to you. You guys actually did an episode on Jeffrey Dahmer. What do you make of this whole situation?
I think it's kind of ridiculous. I think it's a real narrowing down of the possibilities of what gay history can be, and looking at the relationship between Dahmer and sort of the popular conception of homosexuality at the time, which is actually very important. You can sort of make the argument, as Ben does in the podcast, that one of the reasons, obviously, why Dahmer's crimes, obviously on their own right, they made the headlines, but they also had this sort of dual effect of because they occurred contemporaneous at the same time as the first sort of decade of the AIDS crisis, he sort of superimposed in the mind of a heterosexual public in America and a homophobic public this relationship between homosexuality and death. So actually, while obviously he's in no way a sort of gay hero, and the way that those stories are told has been quite complicated and been told quite homophobically in the past. There's so much to learn about homosexuality in the 1980s in the US, its relationship with AIDS, and also with race at the time. That means that to say that this isn't a gay story or isn't an LGBTQ story, I think is missing something. It is part of gay history, and the story that we can tell from it is actually about homophobia and about racism and about the combination, how homophobia and racism really intersected.
All right, let's talk politics a bit. Ben, I want to come to you. Some people who read your book might say that you have a rather critical take on LGBTQ politics. You seem very critical of those who are not left-wing. Why?
Well, we made the decision in this book to be very honest about where we're coming from, to show our work and how we got there. And if people want to disagree, then they can. But I don't think it would have made any sense for us to write a book that didn't pretend that we weren't coming from a left wing and what I would consider to be a justice-oriented perspective. Our criticism of people is not, I don't think, at any point in the book for their failure to live up to our ideal of exactly what someone's politics should look like. But instead, we really do try to think about what the options were available to them in their time. And so often the narrative about people in the past is that, oh, well, that was just what the times were, and they couldn't have known any better. But what we find consistently throughout the book is that there are, throughout history, people who are articulating opposition to racism, people articulating opposition to colonialism, people articulating the opposition to patriarchy and misogyny, and those people do exist, and we can't. It would be really patronizing and really bad history writing to completely divest the actors in our book of any agency in making the choices that they made and in expressing and in doing the things that they actually did. The book is not intended to use a kind of contemporary word, cancel anybody. We're not trying to say your faves are problematic, but we are trying to have a really complicated and grown-up conversation about what people actually did. And sometimes that's a critical conversation, and sometimes that's an unpleasant and uncomfortable conversation. And that's certainly a conversation that I think Hugh and I both felt very implicated in personally, and thought it was important that we be implicated in personally.
All right, Hugh, I'm going to come to you. You write in your book that your book investigates the failure of homosexuality as an identity and a political project. Why has it been a failure?
Well, because when we look at the story of how the identity was formed in the 19th century and how it's developed, we can see these pressures that were put on it as a result of the milieu in which it was formed, the conversations that we're having around it, its relationship in the early days, especially towards a sort of scientific sexology and also a criminal justice framework, which actually helped create the identity, which really baked into the idea of homosexuality certain strands that have been really detrimental towards social justice, towards the lives of lots of people. So, for example, its relationship with a sort of masculinism, which manifests in some really unpleasant figures around the far-right politics. The fact that it's formed in Europe through a discourse that's very much tied towards colonialism, so that a lot of these presumptions and prejudices are built into the identity. And both Ben and I would identify as gay men. We're not looking to sort of, as Ben was saying, sort of like scrap that or cast aspersions on other people who do identify as it, but just to say that actually, in some ways, it's been really limited by its birth within that European sort of colonialist and scientific milieu, and at the same time now has really been co-opted as part of a story about the fact that the idea that homosexuality is the necessary consequence or result of the sort of Western liberal democratic process. That's a false history. The Western sort of liberal sort of consensus actually did a lot to sort of spread quite homophobic laws throughout imperialism, the phase of European imperialism, things like that. So by saying we think it's a failure, we pose that as almost a positive, a question to say, where do we go from here? That we don't have to accept these histories and lineages that have created this current identity, and that we can create something new. And so what is it that we want to create that's new, that doesn't reproduce these historical legacies?
Ben, you get the last word on this. Do you have a vision of better politics and better outcomes for the LGBTQ2S community?
I do, yes. I want us to be better allies. I want us to be better fighters. I want us to be braver. I want us to be bolder. And I want a world that's more peaceful and more just and more bountiful and more interesting than the one that we have now.
And that's where
I want us to do our part in getting there.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Ben, Hugh, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. Great stuff.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.